The first time Patricia Hale called it an inspection, my stomach turned. She stood on my driveway like a queen on a throne, clipboard tucked tight under one arm, sunglasses glinting in the midday sun. But her gaze wasn't on me. It was fixed on Emily, my 15-year-old niece, who'd stepped outside in denim shorts and a t-shirt. The way Patricia's lips curved told me she wasn't here to check fences or lawns. She was here to strip dignity. "Young lady," she said sharply, like a teacher calling on a student, "those clothes don't meet Willow Creek's decency standards. I'll need to note this violation." Her pen hovered like a dagger. Emily froze on the porch, her knuckles whitening on the railing, and I felt the heat of July crawl up my neck. Shorts, a t-shirt. That was her crime. What Patricia didn't realize was that Emily wasn't alone, and I wasn't just another neighbor intimidated by her clipboard. My last name already carried weight here. My brother wore the robe, but I carried the same fire. And I wasn't letting her weaponize a bylaw against a child. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now, because this showdown was about to turn into a masterclass in fighting back. I stepped forward, calm, but steel edged my voice. "You should know something, the officer of rules. That so-called decency clause you keep waving around, it was struck down in court 2 years ago. Your bylaws are out of date." Her smile faltered for half a second, just enough to show she'd been caught off guard. "My name is Daniel Mercer," I said, steady but rising so the neighbors lingering on their porches could hear. "Civil rights attorney. I don't just read laws, I dismantle them when they're used as weapons." But this wasn't about my title or professional pride. This was about Emily, my brother's daughter, a man who wore the uniform overseas, who never came home. The last thing he told me before deployment wasn't goodbye. It was, "Take care of her, Dan. She's all I've got." Every time I looked at Emily, I carried that promise. And watching her cheeks flush under the officer of rules' gaze was more than violation. It was betrayal. My niece's hand trembled on the railing. "Uncle Dan," she whispered, her voice breaking, small and fragile in the open air. The sound cracked something in me I hadn't felt since the day I buried her father. This wasn't about grass height or fence paint. This was humiliation dressed as policy. The officer of rules wasn't protecting the community. She was feeding on power. Blinds shifted, whispers hissed, but no one spoke. That was her real power, silence dressed as order. But silence doesn't run in my blood. I moved in front of my niece, placing myself between her and the clipboard. The clipboard queen raised her chin, smirk twitching back into place. As if my defiance was a challenge she was eager to swat down. "Mr. Mercer, you'll find our standards are clear. Failure to comply results in escalating penalties, up to property seizure if necessary." She really said that, about shorts, to a grieving child. I locked eyes with her, letting the fury in my chest steady into something sharper. "You're not writing her up," I said. "Not today, not ever." The sun beat down on us, cicadas droning like static in the background, but the silence that followed was heavier than heat. My niece pressed into my back, seeking shelter. And in that moment, I wasn't just an uncle or a lawyer. I was a wall, and the clipboard queen had no idea she'd just slammed her clipboard into steel. Because while she thought this was about one violation, I knew better. This was about an entire neighborhood shackled under her rule of fear. And what she didn't see, behind one of those lifted curtains, was a conflicted board member whose conscience was already cracking, or the judge downtown, whose eyes would soon fall on the evidence the clipboard queen herself created. Her empire looked polished in the sun, but from where I stood, I could already see the fractures. By the next morning, the enforcer in Crimson Hale's flyers were already plastered across the neighborhood. "Community Standards Reminder," the bold heading screamed, with a bullet list of dress codes that read more like a school uniform policy than a suburban HOA guideline. At the bottom, stamped in block letters, was her favorite word: mandatory. My niece's photo wasn't on the sheet, not this time, but the timing wasn't coincidence. She wanted the neighborhood to connect the dots, to whisper about the girl who wore shorts and the uncle who challenged her. She wanted humiliation to spread wider than a single driveway. As I pulled the paper from our mailbox, the sound of a basketball dribbling echoed across the cul-de-sac. 2 kids froze mid-game, glancing nervously at the flyer I held. Their mother stood at the edge of their yard, clutching a phone, her eyes darting between me and the corner of the street where the enforcer in Crimson's crimson blazer had just appeared. She moved house by house like a meter maid, clipboard tucked tight, lips curved in that same permanent smirk. Neighbors greeted her with half smiles that didn't reach their eyes, taking her flyers like they were court summonses. Nobody refused, nobody spoke. That was her genius, turning silence into submission. But silence cracks eventually. Rachel Alvarez was the first to break. She ripped a flyer from the park board, voice shaking. "She fined my son for a shirt logo. He's 12. I folded the crumpled flyer in my hand until the edges dug into my palm. "You didn't fail him, Rachel. She failed all of us." She nodded, but her eyes stayed downcast, shame heavy on her shoulders. That was the enforcer in Crimson's real victory. Not the fines, not the notices, but the way she turned good parents into people who second-guess their own children. By afternoon, stories bled out everywhere. Mr. Chen muttered about the day the tyrant in heels wrote him up for sidewalk chalk his daughter had left behind. A retired teacher whispered how she was threatened with loss of voting privileges if she didn't repaint her shutters. And then there was Marcus Reed, board secretary, loyal note-taker, the man who'd sat beside the tyrant in heels for years without flinching. I caught him outside his garage, wiping oil from his hands onto a rag. His face was drawn, jaw tight, but his eyes flicked to me with something I hadn't seen before: hesitation. "Careful, Daniel," he muttered, too low for anyone else to hear. "You push her, she'll push harder. That's how she works." His hand trembled against the rag before he shoved it deep into his pocket. He didn't wait for me to answer. He just walked back inside, the door slamming harder than it needed to. It was the first crack in his armor, but not the last. That night, I walked the girl on the porch down to the swing set, where she'd spent summers flying high into the sky, while my brother laughed from the porch. Now she just sat, rocking lightly, her knees pulled up, her eyes locked on the oak tree that shaded the park. "Do they all hate me?" she whispered, barely audible. I crouched beside her. "They don't hate you, Em. They're scared of her. But scared doesn't last forever." The truth was, the Tyrant in Heels flyers weren't about rules. They were about theater. Every paper she stapled, every word she typed, every find she bragged about at HOA meetings, it was performance designed to make fear look like authority. But what she didn't realize was that the stage she'd built was about to turn against her. Because fear only works when nobody questions it. And thanks to the girl on the porch, thanks to Rachel, thanks to every neighbor who whispered their humiliation in the shadows, that silence was beginning to fracture. I steadied her shoulder. "Families like ours don't bend forever," I told her, and I knew exactly where to push when the time came. The next HOA meeting was where the fractures widened. The Tyrant in Heels staged it like she always did. Folding chairs lined in the perfect rows, a podium planted beneath the HOA banner, and her clipboard polished like it was a gavel. She thrived on performance, turning a rec center into her personal courtroom. Under flickering lights, the room felt ready to snap, and there, sitting to the Tyrant in Heels' right, was Marcus Reed. The man I couldn't stop thinking about since our brief conversation outside his garage. He looked different tonight. His shirt collar sat askew, a bead of sweat tracing his temple even before the meeting began. His hands never rested, tapping the pen against the table, straightening the stack of agendas, rubbing his knuckles raw as though he could wipe something off his skin. He didn't need to say a word. His body was screaming what his voice wouldn't. He was torn. The clipboard queen called the meeting to order with the smug authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "We have multiple community standards violations this month," she announced, eyes darting toward the girl on the porch in the second row. My niece shrank in her seat, her knees pressed together, while the clipboard queen's smile widened. "And certain residents," she continued, "have ignored repeated warnings." Every syllable was a knife. I leaned forward in my chair, feeling the old oak roots of our neighborhood in my bones, the promise I'd made to protect what my brother left behind. But my eyes weren't on the clipboard queen. They were locked on Marcus. He cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, then dropped one. His hand hovered over it far too long before picking it up. fingers trembling as though holding evidence he wanted to burn. When the clipboard queen spoke again, her words came clipped and cold. As of this moment, new inspection protocols will be enforced. Dress, property, conduct, all subject to review. She tapped her clipboard for effect, a queen declaring new laws. The room erupted in whispers. Marcus flinched hard, his pen clattering to the floor before his shaking hand reclaimed it. That was the moment I knew. He wasn't just tired. He wasn't just complicit. He was drowning under the weight of secrets he couldn't carry much longer. Patricia noticed too. Her gaze snapped toward him, sharp as glass, narrowing and warning. The smirk slid for just a second, replaced by the flash of command she reserved for those who strayed. Marcus sat up straighter immediately, but his shoulders stayed hunched, eyes fixed anywhere but hers. The tension was so thick it hummed, vibrating through every whispered exchange around me. I leaned back in my chair, my voice low but steady when I finally spoke. "Is that even legal?" Heads turned. Patricia stiffened. Marcus froze. For one heartbeat, I thought he might answer, that he might look up, meet my eyes, and confirm the crack already widening beneath Patricia's throne. Instead, he shifted the papers in front of him and stayed silent, the ink smearing where his damp palms had pressed. But silence can be as loud as confession. And in that silence, the neighbors saw something they'd never seen before: fear on the board's own table. The rest of the meeting blurred into procedural nonsense. Patricia reciting fines, dismissing concerns, posturing like the monarch she believed herself to be. But every time she barked a new demand, Marcus's pen slipped further, his tapping louder, his face paler. His body betrayed him, no matter how hard he tried to play the loyal officer. By the time we filed out, whispers filled the air thicker than humidity. Rachel brushed past me, her eyes darting to Marcus before she whispered, "He knows something." She was right. He did. And, whether he realized it yet or not, his body had already spoken for him. Outside, the summer night wrapped heavy around us, crickets sawing at the silence the clipboard queen left behind. Emily clung to my arm, quiet but resolute. "Uncle Daniel," she murmured, "she's never going to stop, is she?" I squeezed her hand, watching Marcus linger by the door, his head bowed, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets like he was hiding a war inside himself. "She will," I said finally. "Because people like him, they can't keep standing still forever." The next morning, I found the notice taped to my front door. Thick black marker slashed across the envelope. Mandatory compliance. The clipboard queen's handwriting was unmistakable, the sharp angles of her letters as pointed as her voice. I ripped it open on the porch, Emily standing beside me in her hoodie, arms crossed tight as if she could fold herself invisible. The letter wasn't just a warning, it was a list, a grotesque checklist of clothing restrictions, behavioral guidelines, and inspection dates. They had circled the girl on the porch's name 3 times, underlined it in red, and at the bottom, the clipboard queen had scrawled, "Failure to comply will result in police enforcement." Police. Again. My hands clenched around the paper until it tore. The girl on the porch flinched at the sound, her eyes wide, a question forming on her lips she didn't want to ask. I crumpled the rest and shoved it into my pocket, jaw tight. The line between HOA authority and outright harassment had vanished, and the enforcer in crimson was daring me to challenge her. By noon her threats papered every mailbox and door, the neighborhood buzzing with fear. But amid the storm, one thing stood out: Marcus. I spotted him at the mailboxes, his posture hunched, his head darting left and right, like a man trying not to be seen. When his eyes met mine, he froze. For a moment, he looked like he might cross the street, but then his shoulders sagged. He waited until the cluster of neighbors had walked away before stepping close. "You shouldn't let her get to the girl on the porch," he muttered, his voice low, almost buried under the chirp of cicadas. "Then stop enabling her," I shot back. His jaw tightened. His hand went to the back of his neck, rubbing hard as though he could erase the tension building under his skin. He glanced toward the HOA office down the block, then back at me, eyes darting like a trapped animal. "It's not that simple," he said finally, before stuffing his mail under his arm and walking away without another word. But that stumble, that crack, was all I needed. The enforcer in Crimson's empire was wobbling, and Marcus was the fault line. That evening, the enforcer in Crimson doubled down. She paraded through the neighborhood with 2 volunteers trailing her, clipboards in hand, as if she were leading some holy crusade. She stopped at houses, scribbled notes, and snapped photos with her phone. When she reached Rachel Alvarez's porch, Rachel stood tall, refusing to let her cross the threshold. Their exchange carried across the lawn, Rachel's sharp Spanish cutting through the enforcer and Crimson's smug English. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispers growing louder with each insult the enforcer and Crimson hurled. I stood at the edge of my driveway, Emily beside me, and made sure the enforcer and Crimson saw me watching. She smiled, a cold, deliberate curl of lips, and raised her clipboard like a weapon. "This community will learn what standards mean," she called out, her voice slicing through the twilight. "Even if I have to enforce them, house by house." The crowd shifted uneasily. Rachel's son whispered something sharp under his breath. Mr. Chen crossed his arms, silent but furious. And Marcus, standing at the edge of the volunteers, looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. He didn't write a single note. His clipboard hung limp at his side. That night, my niece cried quietly in her room, her posters glowing faintly under string lights. I sat on the porch steps, staring at the torn notice in my hand, feeling every oak root under my feet, pressing upward like a reminder. The enforcer in Crimson thought she was breaking us. But she had just overplayed her hand. I wasn't just a contractor with calloused palms and years of blueprints under my belt. I understood structures, how they were built, how they cracked, how the smallest stress point could bring the whole frame down. The officer of rules was building herself a tower of paper and intimidation, and towers like that. They never stood for long. When I finally closed my eyes, I wasn't planning repairs anymore. I was planning demolition. The morning after the Officer of Rules' parade, I drove past the HOA clubhouse on my way to a job site. It looked the same as always: stucco walls, faded green trim, the same cracked asphalt in the lot. But something about it gnawed at me. I slowed down, studying the roofline, the drainage gutters, the electrical panels mounted outside. Years of habit kicked in. My eyes don't just look at buildings, they read them. What I saw made my stomach tighten. The panels were decades old, spliced with ungrounded wires. It was a hazard waiting to happen, and the Officer of Rules' kingdom sat right at the center of it. I parked a block away and walked back, clipboard in hand, blending in like any other contractor checking a site. The closer I got, the uglier it looked. Exposed wiring, improper load distribution, an HVAC unit patched together with duct tape and rust. All of it in plain sight, none of it to code. And here was the Officer of Rules, running around slamming kids against cruisers and inspecting teenagers' clothes, while her own clubhouse couldn't pass a single inspection. The irony burned. I snapped photos quietly, angles tight and clean, making sure every serial number and junction point was visible. My hands didn't shake. Years on job sites had trained me to be precise, even under pressure, but my chest thudded hard enough to echo in my ears. This wasn't just negligence, it was liability. If a fire broke out during one of her so-called decency meetings, the HOA wouldn't just lose power, they'd lose everything. Insurance wouldn't touch them. Property values would nosedive, and I knew exactly where to take this. That night, I spread the photos across my dining table. My niece hovered at the edge of the room, her sweatshirt sleeves pulled over her hands, watching me sort images like evidence in a trial. "Is this about her?" she whispered. "It's about all of us," I told her, sliding one picture closer. She built her power on fear, but fear doesn't survive against facts. She saw the photos and let out a low hiss. "That's the clubhouse?" "Wiring's a nightmare. Whole system is decades out of compliance," I said. "One spark and the place goes up." She pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes darting toward my niece. "And she's been holding meetings there every week." "Exactly," I said. "She preaches safety, decency, order, but her own house of power is a tinderbox, and the county inspector doesn't look kindly on hypocrites." Rachel's face shifted from fear to something sharper. Hope, maybe, or relief. "So you can prove it?" I tapped the stack of photos. Every wire, every code violation. She's not just abusive, she's reckless, and reckless gets shut down. Later, when the neighborhood quieted, I walked the perimeter again. The officer of rules' blinds were open across the street from the clubhouse, her figure pacing inside, phone to her ear. Even from here, I could feel her confidence radiating, the smug certainty of someone who thought she held every card. She had no idea her fortress was already crumbling. By midnight, my packet was ready. Photos labeled, code sections highlighted, a timeline drafted in my handwriting, showing dates of meetings, attendance numbers, risk factors. It wasn't just a folder. It was a blueprint of collapse. The officer of rules thought she understood power because she could wave flyers and bark orders. But power is about structure, and her structure was rotten to the core. As I slid the folder into my satchel, my niece peeked out from her room. Her voice was small but steady. "Uncle Dan, will this make her stop?" I knelt, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It won't just make her stop, Em. It'll show everyone she never had the right to start." The oak tree outside swayed in the night breeze, roots deep in the soil where my father's ashes rested. It reminded me why this mattered, not just for my niece, not just for Rachel, but for every neighbor who had swallowed silence while Patricia strutted in her heels. Tomorrow, I'd put this evidence in the right hands. And when I did, her clipboard wouldn't protect her anymore. It would bury her. By dawn, the packet sat heavy in my satchel, its edges digging into my side with every step I took through the kitchen. I hadn't slept, not because I couldn't, but because I refused. Evidence means nothing if you let it gather dust. I'd planned to drive it straight to the county office the moment they opened, but Patricia beat me to the punch. At 7:15 sharp, the sound of nails pounding wood jolted Emily from the breakfast table. She flinched so hard the spoon clattered out of her hand. Rachel froze mid-pour, coffee splashing across the counter. The thuds came again, sharp, deliberate, hammer blows announcing war. I yanked the door open. There she was, crimson blazer, clipboard under her arm, loyalists in tow. They weren't whispering today. They wanted everyone to see. As she held a bright red slip, high like a flag, and nailed it directly onto our fence post. The words bled across the paper in bold type, "Final removal order." Emily gasped. Rachel pressed a hand to her mouth, pale as the paper beneath the ink. Patricia turned, her smile wide and deliberate. "Failure to comply will result in immediate seizure of property," she declared, loud enough for every porch in the cul-de-sac to hear. "This family is no longer in good standing with Willow Glen." Her loyalists scribbled notes, stuffing copies into mailboxes as if they were passing out scripture. Neighbors peeked from curtains, some clutching mugs, others simply frozen. I stepped down the walk, each step pounding with the heat rising in my chest. "You have no authority to do this." Her smile didn't waver. "Authority is what the community recognizes, and right now," she gestured to the flyers her aides had just shoved into door handles. "They recognize me," Rachel whispered. "Daniel," her voice tight with fear. I planted myself between the clipboard queen and the door. "You've crossed the line. This isn't enforcement. It's intimidation. And it ends today." Her smirk sharpened. "Or what? You'll sue? Drag your little evidence folder into court. By the time a judge hears it, this house will be empty." The words cut deeper than I expected, not because they were true, they weren't, but because she knew exactly how to weaponize fear. She didn't need authority, she needed doubt. Doubt spreads faster than any fact. My niece stood in the doorway, sweatshirt sleeves pulled over her fists, eyes wide and shimmering. She whispered, "Uncle Dan," and I saw her lip tremble. That was it. No more hesitation. I ripped the slip from the fence, crumpling it in my fist. The paper cracked under the pressure. "This order means nothing, and soon everyone will know why." Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her lips twitched. For the first time, her mask slipped. "Careful, Daniel. You're not just fighting me. You're fighting the system that protects property values. People won't side with you when their wallets are on the line." I leaned closer, my voice low enough that only she could hear. "You built your empire on fear, but I've built mine on structure, and yours is already collapsing." Her smile faltered, just for a heartbeat. Then she turned on her heel, clipboard clutched tight, heels striking the pavement like gavel blows. The moment she disappeared, Rachel collapsed onto the porch steps, the red slip trembling in her hands. "Daniel, how long can we live like this?" I crouched beside her, placing the crumpled notice on the ground. "Not much longer," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "She thinks this is her strongest move, but all she's done is expose herself further." My niece pressed against my side, her head buried in my arm. Her breath hitched with every word she tried to form, but nothing came out. I held her tight, the vow I'd made to my brother burning like iron in my chest. That night, I couldn't sit still. The plan was already forming. I sat at my desk, the photos of the clubhouse wiring spread out again. The affidavit draft I'd begun for Marcus untouched in the corner. My satchel lay open, the packet ready, waiting. But this wasn't just about delivering evidence anymore. This was about timing, spectacle. The Clipboard Queen understood theater better than anyone. If I wanted to dismantle her power, I had to beat her on her stage. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper and scrawled a single word at the top: momentum. That was the key. Evidence was power, but momentum was the wrecking ball. And after today, there was no going back. By morning, the cul-de-sac buzzed like a hornet's nest. The Clipboard Queen's removal notice had done its job. Neighbors whispered in clusters at mailboxes, clutching the red slips like they were eviction orders from on high. Fear was her favorite ink, and she'd spilled it across every door in Willow Glen. But fear isn't unbreakable. It cracks under weight, and Marcus Reed was about to crack. I spotted him that evening under the oak tree, standing so still it was like the roots held him in place. He wasn't wearing his usual collared shirt, no clipboard under his arm, just a rumpled jacket, his hands shoved so deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched forward. His eyes flicked from house to house, like a man deciding which direction his courage could survive. I crossed the street. He didn't move, didn't even glance up until I was close enough to hear the scrape of his breath. "You shouldn't have ripped down that notice," he muttered, voice low, frayed at the edges. "She shouldn't have nailed it up." His jaw tightened. For a long moment, silence stretched between us. Then he exhaled, heavy, like a dam giving way. "I signed half those things, not just yours. Alvarez, Chen, the Mitchells down the corner. Every time she pushed one across the table, I signed." His hand came out of his pocket, trembling as he ran it across his face. "God help. Me, I signed them all." The confession hit harder than I expected, not because I didn't suspect it, but because of the way his voice cracked around the words. He wasn't just admitting complicity, he was drowning in it. I didn't let the silence soften. "Then you know exactly how far this has gone, and you know how it ends if you keep standing behind her." He flinched, eyes darting toward his house. A curtain shifted. His wife's silhouette lingered in the glow of the kitchen light. Two small heads bobbed past her. His children. His breath hitched. "She told me once," he whispered, "fear works better than law." That's what she said. His words burned, not because they surprised me, but because I knew he carried them like a brand. He was confessing not just what he'd done, but what he'd become under her shadow. "You don't have to keep laughing," I said. "Not anymore." He shook his head. "If I speak against her, she'll gut me. My wife, my kids. She'll turn this whole street against us. She'll bury us in fines until we choke." "She can't," I snapped, sharper than I meant. "Legally, she has nothing left. Her authority's expired, Marcus. Every fine, every violation, it's smoke. And if you speak, if you put it in writing, you won't just clear your conscience, you'll bring the whole structure down." His hands trembled harder now. He pulled a folded slip of paper from his pocket, creased, worn, the ink smeared from sweat. He opened it slowly. Across the top, the Clipboard Queen's handwriting scrawled bold, "Teach them fear." My chest went cold. "She wrote that?" She shoved it across the table at me after Alvarez's boy got fined for a t-shirt. Said we had to make examples. I was supposed to file it. Instead, I kept it. His voice broke. I don't know why. Maybe part of me knew this day would come. That slip of paper wasn't just proof. It was intent. Intent that could topple her faster than any expired filing. I held his gaze. "Then give it to me. Let me put it where she can't bury it." For a long moment, he didn't move. His fingers clutched the paper like it was burning him alive. Then, with a shaky breath, he pressed it into my hand. Do what I can't, he whispered. I folded it carefully, sliding it into the satchel, already bulging with evidence. You just did. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face under the oak tree, haunted, drained, his trembling hand pressing that slip of paper into mine. Teach them fear. 3 words scrawled in Patricia's handwriting, but they carried the weight of every bruise, every fine, every humiliation she'd carved into Willow Glen. By dawn, the paper sat on my desk beside the expired incorporation record. 2 documents. One proved she had no legal authority. The other proved she'd weaponized fear as policy. Together, they weren't just evidence. They were demolition charges stacked at the base of her fortress. But charges don't explode on their own. You need timing, placement, and precision. That was where my skill set came in. I wasn't just a neighbor with a grudge. I was a civil engineer, trained to calculate load paths, stress points, and failure cascades. And I knew this. The bigger the structure, the more dramatic the collapse when you hit the right joint. The enforcer in Crimson's empire wasn't made of concrete and steel. It was made of silence, shame, and intimidation. And Marcus had just handed me the joint that would bring it all down. Rachel padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her robe trailing behind her. She set a mug of coffee in front of me and leaned against the counter, studying the evidence. You look like you're about to go to war. I didn't look up. I am. She folded her arms. And war needs a plan. I spread out notes, citations, dates, Marcus's slip. Her entire empire was theater built on fear. My counter had to flip her stage. The answer was clear. Spectacle. She wanted an audience when she slammed my niece against that cruiser, when she plastered flyers across the park, when she paraded her laminated poster at the school drop-off. She thrived on stagecraft. So, her downfall had to happen in the same theater, with the same lights, only this time, she wouldn't control the script. I circled 3 upcoming events on the neighborhood calendar, tacked to our fridge: the Saturday yard sale, Monday's HOA board meeting, and the county inspection scheduled midweek. Each one was a pressure point. If I timed it right, the whole community would see her unravel. By mid-morning, I made calls, quiet, precise. The county inspector I'd spoken to yesterday agreed to attend the HOA meeting. His presence a shadow she wouldn't see until it was too late. Marcus, though terrified, promised he'd stand with me when the moment came, and Judge Reynolds, the one who'd watched that first live stream of my niece's assault, confirmed he would review the evidence if it reached his chambers. The net was tightening. All I had to do was make sure the enforcer in Crimson walked straight into it. That afternoon, I walked the cul-de-sac with Emily by my side. She clutched my hand, sweatshirt still tugged low over her shorts, but her steps felt steadier than before. Neighbors peeked from porches, whispers trailing in our wake. I didn't try to hide the folder under my arm. Let them see it. Let them wonder. Fear was the enforcer in Crimson's tool. Curiosity would be mine. At the park bulletin board, I pinned a simple notice. Community meeting. HOA legal status under review. Residents encouraged to attend Monday's session. Verified documentation available. No dramatics, no accusations. Just enough truth to spread like wildfire. Within minutes, phones were snapping photos, texts buzzing across the block. That night, as the sun sank, behind the oak tree, I sat back at my desk and sketched a structural diagram on scrap paper, not of a building, but of her authority. At the base, expired incorporation. In the middle, Marcus's testimony. At the top, community trust, already fractured. Strike the base and middle at once, and the top couldn't stand. I taped the diagram to the wall above my desk. It wasn't just strategy, it was inevitability. Rachel stepped in quietly, resting her hand on my shoulder. "You're ready," she said. I glanced at Emily, curled asleep on the couch, the glow of her phone still lighting her face. For weeks, the Clipboard Queen had turned her into a prop for fear. In 2 days, she'd be the reason the Clipboard Queen's empire collapsed. "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time since this started, I meant it. The notice I'd pinned to the park board spread faster than I imagined. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive kicked over. Kids on scooters carried whispers from block to block. Phones lit up with text chains that bled across group chats. People who'd avoided eye contact for months now leaned over fences, asking each other, "What's going on Monday?" That was the point. Patricia's grip depended on silence, not questions. Once people started asking, the silence fractured. I tightened my tie in the bathroom mirror that evening, not because I cared about appearances, but because I knew she did. She measured worth in polish, in posture, in how convincingly you could pretend to be in control. So I would meet her on that stage looking like I belonged in every courtroom she'd never dare enter. Marcus called just before sunset. His voice shook, but his words were steady. "I've copied my notes. I'll read them if I have to." "You won't be alone," I said. "The inspector's coming, the sheriff too." Silence stretched, then he exhaled. "If this blows up, my kids, they'll thank you," I cut in. "Maybe not today, but when they're old enough to see what fear does, they'll know you stopped it." He didn't answer, just hung up. But I knew he'd be there. That night, I printed everything. Copies of the expired incorporation record, Marcus's handwritten slip, the affidavit he signed, screenshots of flyers, stamped envelopes from the licensing bureau. I stacked them in a neat pile, slid them into a satchel, and set it by the door. My wrecking ball wasn't steel, it was paper. But the swing would land just as hard. Rachel brushed past me in the hall, setting my niece's backpack on the hook. "She's still scared to go to school," she murmured. The girl on the porch lingered nearby, sweatshirt sleeves tugged low, her face half hidden behind her phone. She glanced at the satchel, then at me. "You're really gonna stop her?" I crouched, steadying my voice. "No, Em, we're going to stop her. Monday's the end of this." Her lip trembled, but for the first time, her eyes didn't look away. By Saturday morning, Patricia doubled down. Flyers bloomed like weeds across mailboxes. Violation crackdown, unrest will not be tolerated. Her SUV prowled the cul-de-sac, her clipboard flashing like a badge. But the tone had changed. Neighbors didn't scatter when she walked by. They muttered, phones tilted up. Even whispers carried sharp edges now. At the yard sale that afternoon, I tested the waters. At the yard sale, Mrs. Alvarez whispered, "We're coming Monday." Mr. Chen nodded. "I'm done hiding." Rachel drifted beside me, sliding a plate of cookies onto a table. "You don't have to rally them so hard," she whispered. "Yes, I do. Fear works until people realize they're not alone. Monday has to feel bigger than her clipboard." By Sunday night, the neighborhood looked different. Porch lights flickered on earlier, conversations carried later. The clipboard queen still marched the sidewalks, but every step she took sounded like an echo of something ending. She knew people were gathering. She just didn't know how fast the stage was being built beneath her feet. I spent the evening at my desk, sketching a final checklist. Inspector confirmed attendance. Sheriff confirmed presence. Marcus prepared with affidavit. Community primed with notice. Evidence organized and sealed. The diagram on my wall, her empire collapsing like a leaning tower, looked less like theory now, more like inevitability. Rachel set her hand on my shoulder. "You've lined up every piece. Now all that's left is swinging." I stared at the satchel, its straps stretched tight against the weight of paper inside. Tomorrow I wouldn't carry it like evidence. I'd carry it like a hammer. The girl on the porch padded into the room, her steps soft. She pointed at the diagram taped above my desk. "That's her?" "That's her," I said. She studied the lines for a moment, then whispered, "It doesn't look so strong when you draw it." I smiled faintly. It never was. That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from the pounding rhythm of anticipation. The clipboard queen thought Monday would be another of her stages, a room where she barked orders, silenced dissent, waved citations like scripture. But this time, her theater had a new script, and when the lights came on, she'd be the one on trial. The morning air felt charged, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Morning buzzed with tension. Every sound felt too loud. I tightened the strap of the satchel on my shoulder, papers sealed and ready. It wasn't just a folder anymore. It was a wrecking ball. Rachel brushed past me at the door, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "You've got everything?" Her voice carried the edge of someone who hadn't slept. "Everything that matters," I said, lifting the satchel slightly. Emily sat at the table, staring into her mug of cocoa. The oversized sweatshirt still covered her shorts, a shield she wouldn't let go of. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were searching. "Will she be there?" "Yes," I said, "and so will we." Her lip trembled, but she nodded. That was enough. By the time I stepped outside, the cul-de-sac was already alive with uneasy energy. Neighbors who once hurried past without eye contact now lingered on driveways, whispering sharp fragments into their phones, stealing glances at Patricia's black SUV parked squarely at the curb. She stood at the steps of the clubhouse, crimson blazer gleaming in the sunlight, clipboard clutched like a scepter. Marcus Reed emerged from his house moments later, the affidavit clutched tight in his hand. His stride was stiff, his face drawn, but he crossed the street without hesitation. When he reached me, he gave a small nod. No words, just resolve. The inspector's van rolled in next, its logo stark against the white paint. County Code Enforcement Division. The murmurs in the crowd rippled louder, and people craned their necks to watch. Seconds later, a sheriff's cruiser followed, lights flickering once as if to announce judgment had arrived. The clipboard queen's smirk faltered when she saw them, but she quickly snapped it back into place. "Quite the show you've organized," she called out, her voice sharp. I walked forward until I was standing a few feet away, satchel heavy against my hip. "Not a show," I said evenly. "An accounting." Her jaw tightened. Inside, the clubhouse buzzed with fluorescent light and low whispers. Folding chairs filled every inch, neighbors shoulder to shoulder, phones glowing as cameras tilted upward. The tyrant in heels banged her gavel against the table, but the sound didn't command silence. It was swallowed by the weight of bodies leaning forward, waiting. "This meeting will come to order," she declared, voice brittle. "Anyone who disrupts will face fines." A murmur of laughter swept through the crowd. Someone whispered, "With what authority?" And the words carried farther than they should have. The tyrant in heels' eyes snapped toward the back, but she found no willing scapegoat. The inspector took his time, setting his folder down on the table beside her. He didn't speak yet, just flipped slowly through stamped forms. Each turn of the page was another nail hammered into her mask. I felt the eyes of the room shift toward me. My pulse thundered, but my voice came out steady. "We all know what this is. It isn't about weeds or fences or noise. It's about humiliation used as law. A child branded indecent, a community ruled by fear, and a president who forgot her authority expired 2 years ago." Patricia slammed her palm on the table. "Baseless lies!" Marcus's voice broke the air, quiet but firm. "They're not lies. I signed it." He held the affidavit aloft, his hand shaking, but his words didn't. "She told us fear works better than law. I heard it. I wrote it down. I can't stay silent anymore." Gasps rippled through the crowd, heads turned, phones angled closer. The inspector finally looked up, his voice calm but heavy. "Per county records, this association's incorporation lapsed over 26 months ago. All enforcement actions since then are invalid. This proceeding is now under review." The silence cracked into shouts. Some neighbors clapped, others muttered in disbelief. Patricia barked, "Clerical error, easily fixed." But her words sounded hollow. The deputy stepped forward, his tone harder. "There's also an active investigation into harassment of a minor. Until it concludes, you will refrain from direct enforcement. That's not a request." The gavel shook in her grip, her hand trembling for the first time. I pulled the stamped papers from my satchel and laid them in front of her, the seals catching the fluorescent light. "This isn't my word against yours, the tyrant in heels. It's paper, signed, stamped, official, and paper doesn't bow to fear." The crowd leaned closer, the weight of silence no longer hers to command. And in that moment, I knew. The wrecking ball had left my hand, and the swing had just begun. The air in the clubhouse felt heavier than cement, the kind that pressed into your lungs and dared you to breathe. Rows of folding chairs were jammed with neighbors leaning forward, eyes flashing, phones recording every twitch of the tyrant in heels' face. The fluorescent lights hummed above, harsh and merciless, casting her crimson blazer like a warning flare. The officer of rules gripped the gavel so tight, her knuckles bleached white. She banged it once, twice, the sound clattering hollow against the table. "This is my meeting," she snapped, and anyone recording without permission will face penalties. The crowd answered with laughter, not loud, not mocking, just the kind of low ripple that comes when fear has snapped and the silence no longer belongs to the tyrant. Someone muttered, "What penalties?" And phones tilted higher. Marcus shifted beside me, his affidavit trembling in his grip. He looked pale, but he didn't step back. When the officer of rules sneered at him, eyes sharp as glass, he lifted his chin just enough. For the first time, he wasn't shrinking. The inspector cleared his throat, voice calm but cutting. "Correction, Ms. Klein. This is no longer your meeting. This is a hearing under county review. You hold no legal authority here." Gasps rippled. Patricia's jaw twitched. "You can't strip me of my title." The deputy's voice cut her down. "We already have, and if you disrupt this hearing, you'll be escorted out." His hand hovered near his belt, not as a threat, but as a reminder. The officer of rules' smirk faltered, but she recovered fast, clutching the gavel like it might fuse to her hand. "This man," she jabbed a finger at me, her voice rising, "he's orchestrating this circus, angry about citations, angry about consequences. That's all this is." I stepped forward slowly, my satchel heavy at my side. My voice didn't need to rise. It cut clean at ground level. Citations for swing sets, fines for bird baths, threats nailed to fences, and humiliation weaponized against children. I gestured toward Emily, sitting 2 rows back with Rachel's arm around her shoulders. "You plastered a 15-year-old girl's photo on bulletin boards and called it decency. That wasn't law, that was cruelty." A murmur swelled, neighbors shaking their heads, whispering to each other. Mrs. Alvarez stood, voice steady for the first time in months. She fined my 12-year-old for a t-shirt logo, called it obscene. I stayed quiet because I thought she had the power. But she didn't, did she? All eyes turned to the inspector. He adjusted his glasses, his words heavy with finality. "No, not for over 2 years." The crowd erupted. Not cheers, not applause, but a low roar of disbelief and anger. Phones snapped photos, messages flew across group chats, and the air vibrated with the release of fear that had held this cul-de-sac hostage for years. The officer of rules banged the gavel again, her voice shrill now. "You people don't understand. Without me, property values collapse, standards crumble, you'll be living in chaos." The judge's face flickered to life on the monitor at the back of the room. His voice rolled like gravel dragged across stone. "What collapses, Ms. Klein, is tyranny disguised as governance. I saw the footage of you slamming a minor against a police car. I saw the posters you paraded at school drop-off. That wasn't order. That was harassment." Silence slammed over the room, every eye fixed on the monitor, every ear tuned to the weight of the law itself, speaking into their clubhouse. Patricia froze, her painted smile twitching into something broken. "You can't. You don't." The judge leaned closer to the camera. "You are hereby suspended from any administrative role in Willow Glen, pending full legal review. Any further attempt to exercise authority will be considered fraudulent. Do you understand?" Her gavel slipped from her hand, clattering against the table, the sound swallowed by gasps. The crowd surged. Neighbors stood, shouting grievances. Shouts rose, old fines, old wounds, years of anger spilling out. Phones were everywhere, catching every word, every flinch. The officer of rules staggered back in her chair, shrinking inside her own blazer, as if the fabric could shield her. But there was no shield left. Marcus stood, his voice clear. "We don't want rulers, we want neighbors, and you stopped being one a long time ago." He dropped his affidavit onto the table in front of her. The paper fluttered, sharp as a blade. I looked out across the room, the same neighbors who once hid behind curtains now standing shoulder to shoulder. "We rebuild here," I said, voice carrying. "We stop bending to fear. We start holding each other, not punishing each other." The applause came then, not the raucous kind, but steady, like a heartbeat spreading through the room. The officer of rules sat frozen, crimson fading to pale, her clipboard useless, her empire in shreds. And I knew. The wrecking ball had swung clean through her walls, and nothing she built on fear would stand again. The next morning, the cul-de-sac didn't feel like the same place. Sunlight poured across driveways that once felt like prison gates. and instead of people hiding behind curtains, neighbors were out early, talking, laughing, their voices carrying in ways I hadn't heard in years. The air itself felt lighter, like someone had finally opened a window in a house gone stale. The girl on the porch sat on our porch swing, a mug of cocoa cupped between her hands. She pushed back and forth gently, the chains creaking in rhythm. It was the same swing where she used to shout for her father to watch her climb higher, the same swing that had stood silent since the humiliation Patricia nailed to her. This morning, though, there was color in her cheeks again. Not laughter yet, not fully, but peace. Rachel leaned against the railing, brushing the girl on the porch's hair behind her ear. "You're safe now," she whispered. The girl on the porch nodded, the smallest smile breaking across her face. The scar of that day wouldn't vanish overnight, but it wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. Down the block, Marcus hammered a stake reading, "Community Rebuild Meeting, 6 p.m. Neighbors signed their names one after another. I walked over, added my name, and felt something shift deep in my chest. For months, this neighborhood had bent under the weight of fear. Today, the weight lifted. Marcus looked at me as I handed the pen back. His eyes were still tired, but steadier. "This is where it starts," he said. "Not with her rules, with us." His words carried across the lawn, and for the first time, people didn't whisper. They spoke openly. "We can't let it happen again. We need checks, not rulers. We've got kids to protect." The murmur grew into something solid, like bricks laid into a foundation. The officer of Rules' SUV sat motionless in her driveway, its shine dulled, her throne stripped of its arrogance. The county's suspension had landed overnight, stamped with ink and law. Every neighbor had seen her stripped of power in public, her gavel slipping from her hand like a child dropping a toy. And that image, that fall, was burned into memory stronger than any speech she could give. But for me, the symbol wasn't her SUV, or her clipboard, or the gavel she once struck like a war drum. It was the oak tree in my yard, its roots wrapped around the ashes of my father. It was the swing set where Emily once laughed with her cousins, laughter stolen for too long by a scarlet word she didn't deserve. That tree and that swing had carried the weight of silence, and now they carried something else, proof that fear doesn't last when people decide to stand. By dusk, Marcus's lawn filled with folding chairs and paper plates stacked with food. Neighbors hadn't shared in years. Kids ran freely between legs, their chalk drawings spreading across the sidewalk without worry of fines. Mrs. Alvarez brought lemonade, Mr. Chen set out folding lanterns, and when Marcus stood to speak, the crowd hushed, not out of fear, but respect. "We've all seen what happens when power sits in the wrong hands," he said, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "But we also saw what happens when silence breaks." Emily's pain opened our eyes. Daniel's fight carried us here, and now it's on us to rebuild this community the way it should have been all along. Applause rose, not explosive, but steady, like a pulse shared across the block. I scanned the faces, Rachel's relief, Emily's fragile hope, Marcus's redemption, Mrs. Alvarez's fire. This wasn't just victory, it was rebirth. Later, Emily tugged my sleeve. "Uncle Daniel, it's over, right?" I crouched beside her, the swing creaking under her weight. "It's over for her," I said softly. "But for us, this is the beginning. We get to build something better, something your dad would have been proud of." She smiled then, small but real. The kind of smile that said the wound hadn't won. And as she leaned into Rachel's side, I knew my brother's promise still lived, through her, through us, through every neighbor who signed their names under Marcus's board. The clipboard queen had tried to brand a child indecent. Instead, she branded herself as the fraud who mistook fear for law. Her downfall wasn't just her own, it was the foundation of a community remembering its strength. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Because when every fiber in you screams that silence is no longer an option, you speak, you fight, you rebuild, and together we had.